Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls. My name is Vic Allen. This morning, some of us are bringing our best selves to this place. Some of us are bringing our struggling selves, our shattered selves, our difficult selves. All are welcome here. Some of us arrived with open hearts. Some of us aren't quite there yet because our hearts have gotten a little beat up of late and we're not quite sure how to trust. Your heart is welcome here, no matter how bruised. We welcome you among us. All of us are imperfect, but to drop our defenses and trust what happens here is powerful and life-giving. Together, we affirm that this day, our being together can make each of us braver, more compassionate, and wiser than when we woke up this morning. And welcome to you all. A couple of announcements to start things off. We're having a dinner and fundraiser. Our board is planning an online fundraiser where participants would log in and bid on items online. Now, items are needed for this fundraiser, so if you have donatable talents, experiences, or stuff, please contact Cindy Logan or the UUCIF office. Bill Beach has graciously offered to host the men's group this Friday at his home in Firth. The meeting will be held outside, and Bill assures us he will set some stuff on fire to keep us warm. All participants should be fully vaccinated and pass the 2-week waiting period after the last shot. Mask wearing will be at your discretion, but please bring your own food and beverage. Saturday, May 22nd, between 1 and 3, we'll be chalking up our parking lot here at the UU. We'll ask that you park across the street in the post office parking lot so we can fill the parking spaces with chalk. There will also be a giant bubble bucket and wand station as well. There will be knee pads and chairs provided for anyone who needs them. And because of COVID, is an ongoing risk. We'll be asking people to mask up and keep social distance. Summer food program is back for 2021, and we're looking for volunteers to staff a UUCIF team. Elizabeth Coliotti is coordinating our team to participate. If you'd like to participate, you can contact Elizabeth or you can contact the office. But right now, as we move into the service portion of our morning, I'd like to invite you to get comfortable. Relaxed, but still upright. You might even lightly close your eyes. And when you feel relaxed, try taking some deep, slow breaths. Pay special attention to your body and find any tense spots, your forehead, your shoulders, or your back, and deliberately relax them. And as I ring our peace bowl 3 times, let your breathing bring relaxation throughout your body. Please join me now in the reading of our covenant. You'll find the covenant in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This morning, our chalice lighting is adapted from a writing from Odette Fulton. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get to our chalice lighting, well, we just did the covenant. Sorry. Oh, the prelude. Okay. Now you can join us for our Chalice Lighting. This morning our words are adapted from Audette Fulbright Folsom. This light we candle is set in the lamp of our history. We inherit this freedom from the brave and gentle, fierce and outspoken hearts and minds that have come before us. Let us be worthy inheritors of this tradition, and through our good works, pass it boldly forward.
Good morning. Before I read our call to worship this morning, I want to mention that other than the gathering music from Vivaldi, our reading from Nathaniel Hawthorne, and my sermon, most of today's service, from the prelude to the postlude, features the words and music of women. I also want to acknowledge that gender identity is a spectrum and not a simple binary choice, though much of the language in today's service uses male and female and men and women. Today is a celebration of women in UU ministry. Our call to worship comes from Loretta Williams. We bearers of the dream affirm that a new vision of hope is emerging. We pledge to work for that community in which justice will be actively present. We affirm that there is struggle yet ahead. Yet we know that in the struggle is the hope for the future. We affirm that we are co-creators of the future, not passive pawns. And we stand united in affirmation of our hope and vision of a just and inclusive society. We affirm the unity of all persons. We affirm brotherhood and sisterhood that allows us to touch upon each other's humanity. We affirm a unity that opens our eyes, ears, and hearts to see the different but common forms of oppression, suffering, and pain. Yet we are one in the image of God, and we celebrate our hopes for human unity within ourselves and within the gathered community. We will discover the strength not to hide in indifference, affirming that hope publicly expressed energizes and enables us to move forward. Together, we pledge action to transcend barriers, be they racial, political, economic, social, or religious. We pledge to make our tomorrows become our todays. I invite you now to join in our opening hymn, number 123, Spirit of Life.
Spirit of life, come unto Today's Time for All Ages is Tondeka's Change of Heart by Tondeka, read by Elizabeth Coyote, Director of Lifespan Faith Development. This story is from the curriculum What Moves Us. If you like this story, we start these. This week's Time for All Ages, read by Elizabeth Coyote, is Elizabeth Tupper Wilkes, writing for Faith, Hope, and Love. Eliza Tupper Wilkes was born in Maine in 1844. Her father was a Baptist minister, and her mother was a writer and editor. Her mother's job was very unusual. In those days, married women rarely had a profession outside of housekeeping. When Eliza was 5, her family moved to Iowa, a territory that had gained statehood only a few years earlier. People were flocking to this promising new state on the rolling prairie. Its population had doubled from about 75,000 when Eliza was born to more than 150,000 by the time her family moved there. Pioneer life suited the Tupper family very well. A good high school education was hard to find on the frontier, though, so Eliza went back to Maine in 1860 to live with her grandfather and go to school. She returned to Iowa 3 years later and began studying at a new Baptist college. She wanted to become a missionary. After graduation, she took a job as a teacher in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. While she was there, her ideas about religion began to change. The Baptist religion's teachings about hellfire and damnation no longer seemed true to her. To the horror of her family, she decided to join the Universalists. When she was baptized in her new faith, she quipped that she had left the devil behind. The Universalist Church was the first denomination to welcome women ministers. This was lucky for Eliza Tupper. Her interest in missionary work was still strong. Soon she began preaching from the pulpit of the Mount Pleasant Universalist Church. She moved to Wisconsin, where she had her own pulpit as a minister. While in Wisconsin, she met William Wilkes, a young law clerk, and she married him in 1869. The United States was a country on the move in those days. By 1869, you could take a train across the entire continent from the East Coast to the West. More and more people were striking out for new territories in the West. Young people like Eliza and her husband had a world of opportunity before them. The couple first moved to Rochester, Minnesota, where Eliza was ordained as a Universalist minister in 1871. She served as minister there for 3 years. Then they moved on to Colorado. William became a lawyer, and Eliza, now mother of the young son, organized a new Universalist congregation in Colorado Springs and preached there regularly to get it started. The high altitude of Colorado Springs proved to be bad for Eliza's health, though. In 1878, the family was on the move again. They traveled to the Dakota Territory and settled in the frontier town of Sioux Falls. The family eventually had 6 children. Unlike other prosperous husbands in those days, Eliza's husband approved of her career. He willingly paid for household help and tutors for the children so that Eliza could continue her missionary work. Eliza was interested in many kinds of social reform, but she dedicated her life most of all to the establishment of new churches. She knew that among the pioneers on the frontier there were many free-thinking people who hungered to hear the liberal message, and there were few places to hear it. From her home base in Sioux Falls, Eliza organized 7 churches in South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota. Her plan was to turn each one over to another minister after it was established, as she moved on to establishing the next. But ministers were in short supply. Often she needed to serve several churches at once. Reverend Eliza Tupper Wilkes spent many years on the circuit, traveling from town to town, ministering to as many people as she could. On Sundays, she often preached in Rock Rapids, Iowa in the morning, then traveled 15 miles to Luverne, Minnesota for an afternoon service. Nowadays, such a trip would be a quick drive on the highway. For Eliza, it was a long, arduous journey over difficult roads. Eliza Wilkes was a trailblazer, but she was not alone. Other women were establishing Unitarian congregations in Iowa and the surrounding states. Women ministers encouraged other women to come into the ministry, and the sisterhood grew. They often faced people who were hostile to the idea of women in the ministry, but they proved to be so effective that their congregations in the Midwest and the West quickly grew. After Eliza had started a new congregation, she always preferred to turn it over to another woman minister. She believed that women from the local areas were more competent as prairie pastors than the men sent out from the east. The women worked harder and were more willing to accept the low wages that struggling homesteaders could pay. They better understood their parishioners' lives and were more likely to talk about things in the same way as the people they served, unlike some of the young men sent out to the frontier fresh from college. Along with their religious message of optimism and hope, the women ministers tended to bring a comforting, home-like quality to church meetings that attracted both women and men. And beyond their religious duties, they often organized cultural and social events that were much appreciated by people living isolated rural lives. Eliza was delighted when Carrie Bartlett, a dedicated, energetic, and well-educated young minister, agreed to take over the pulpit of the Sioux Falls Unity Church. Eliza had founded the church, and it was where her family attended services. On Sundays, when Reverend Carrie Bartlett was not in the pulpit, Eliza or a guest minister from the Iowa Sisterhood would usually preach in her place. One Sunday, Reverend Bartlett traded pulpits with a male colleague instead. Eliza's little daughter, Queenie, was astonished. She exclaimed in amazement, "Look, Mama! There's a man up there in the pulpit!" Women ministers were still very rare in the rest of the world. Even among Unitarians and Universalists, many people still disapproved of them. But for the young congregation of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, female ministers had become the norm, thanks to the dedication and hard work of a few courageous women. The end.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Each week we take a moment to share joys and concerns amongst ourselves, to unburden ourselves, or to share some joy that hopefully can bring some light to our fellow viewers. This morning, I personally have two concerns I would like to note. The first is my heart goes out to the people of India who are suffering at this moment in unimaginable conditions due to COVID. The other one is also COVID related, and that's for the people of Palestine. The Israeli government has made sure that Israelis are among the most highly vaccinated people in the country, in the world, but the Palestinians under their control have almost no vaccines available. That needs to be remedied now. Also this morning, did we have any other joys?
Victoria McDonald has a joy. The small brown Pacific wrens have returned to her yard, and they sing their song in joyous celebration.
Thank you, Victoria. And we'll light one more candle this morning for those joys and those concerns that we are not yet ready to share. Thank you.
Our reading this morning is an excerpt from the novel Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne, written in 1852. For some context, the novel takes place in the fictional utopian community of Blithedale, which was modeled on the Brook Farm community in West Roxbury, Massachusetts in the 1840s, of which Hawthorne was a co-founder. The passage below is a conversation between the protagonist, Mr. Coverdale, and a wealthy woman named Zenobia. Coverdale says, "Ah, it is you that rate womanhood low, but let me go on. I have never found it possible to suffer a bearded priest so near to my heart and conscience as to do me any spiritual good. I blush at the very thought. Oh, in the better order of things, heaven grant that the ministry of souls be left in charge of women. The gates of the blessed city will be thronged with the multitude that enter in when that day comes. The task belongs to woman. God meant it for her. He has endowed her with the religious sentiment in its utmost depth and purity, refined from that gross intellectual alloy with which every masculine theologist, save only one who merely veiled himself in mortal and masculine shape, but was in truth divine, has been prone to mingle it. I have always envied the Catholics their faith in that sweet, sacred Virgin Mother who stands between them and the deity, intercepting somewhat of his awful splendor, but permitting his love to stream upon the worshiper more intelligibly to human comprehension through the medium of a woman's tenderness." When I was preparing for ministry, I was still working full-time as an IT manager at Hasbro, so I looked for part-time seminary programs in the New England area. I soon found a wonderful cooperative Master of Divinity program that allowed me to begin my studies at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut and complete the second half at Andover Newton Theological School in Massachusetts. And I am glad I chose this path for my seminary education. One of the nice advantages of this approach was that, unlike most theological schools, Hartford Seminary had a strong sociology of religion department as well as a Center for Islamic Studies. This allowed me to take classes that were not typical for most seminarians. And one of my favorite classes was a sociology course titled Women, Religion, and the Future of USA Churches. As I recall, I was one of only 2 UU students in the class, and it was interesting to hear my classmates talk about the state of women in ministry among other denominations, and especially the role of women in American Muslim communities. For my final paper, I decided to dig deep into the history of women in ministry in the Unitarian and Universalist traditions, and that paper, which I wrote in 2008, is the primary source for my sermon today. Since today is Mother's Day, I thought it would be an especially good time to talk about the state of women in UU ministry and to acknowledge the mothers of Unitarian Universalism who have been frequently dismissed and overlooked among the many famous male figures in our history. Until recent times, just finding original source material about these women was a challenge, and it took a significant effort for me to gather many of the statistics you're about to hear. But things have changed dramatically in recent decades, and as Unitarian Universalism enters the second decade of the 21st century, the role of women in ministry and lay leadership in our movement has never been stronger. As members of our liberal faith, we should be proud of our legacy of over 2 centuries of progressive, frequently cutting-edge positions on religious and social justice issues in America. Freedom of conscience was a hallmark of both the Universalists and Unitarians from the early days. And when combined with an openness to biblical criticism born of Enlightenment rationalism, a progressive, inclusive stance on the role of women in church leadership came early in both parent denominations. They're the ones that emerged to form the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961. Women served as leaders of social justice efforts around abolition, women's suffrage, and other issues in the first half of the 19th century. And beginning in 1863 with the Universalists, followed by the Unitarians in 1871, a handful of women began to serve as ordained ministers. One of the most successful examples of women in Unitarian ministry from that period was a group of 21 Unitarian women who formed the so-called Iowa Sisterhood in 1875 with the goal of serving communities throughout the Great Plains. Despite little encouragement and more often outright disdain from the Boston establishment, they became successful at establishing churches throughout a region that most male clergy avoided as being too rural and too difficult a place to live. One of the main reasons the Iowa Sisterhood was successful is that they were more pastoral in their approach to ministry and envisioned the church as a hub for community life throughout the week, not just a place for Sunday worship led by learned ministers. Although she began as a Universalist minister, Eliza Tupper Wilkes, who you heard about in our Time for All Ages this morning, began serving Unitarian churches in her connection with the Iowa Sisterhood, and went on to serve several congregations in California. As an example of the criticism the ministers of the sisterhood received, even after 20 years in the field, one Boston executive with the American Unitarian Association belittled Wilkes' ministry as being, quote, not legitimate Unitarian work. As the decades passed, the number of women entering Unitarian and Universalist ministry waxed and waned in response to currents in American society, and as a reflection of the struggles within both denominations to combat declining numbers and wrestle with issues of denominational identity. By the 1890s, the number of women entering ministry in both denominations was steadily increasing, with the Universalists credentialing 46 women in that decade alone. Though suffrage for women remained unrealized, and the idea of feminism as we know it lay far in the future, it seemed as though women would soon achieve more equal representation among Unitarian and Universalist clergy, despite pockets of resistance that offered the typical arguments against women in Christian ministry, such as authenticity of calling, different natures, belonging to the sphere of the home, and so on. Among Universalists in particular, though, the idea that women could be, quote, called by the Spirit to become ministers was generally accepted. Arguments using the Bible typically cited the usual Pauline objections, but free-thinking Unitarians and Universalists had long since opened the door to biblical error and criticism, so these arguments found little traction among liberal churches. Backlash within both denominations, though, and general shifts in society soon began to chip away at the gains made in the 19th century. The growing fears about the feminizing of American religion in the decades after the Civil War and the spread of the social gospel movement throughout Protestant denominations created an atmosphere that discouraged Unitarian and Universalist women from pursuing ordained ministry and redirected many talented women to more socially acceptable leadership roles in social justice efforts and religious education. As we still see in some denominations today, women who entered seminary with the intention to pursue ordained ministry were often openly discouraged by their instructors and denominational leadership on the basis that parishes seldom asked for female ministers. This trend continued through the first half of the 20th century and probably hit its lowest point during the Depression of the 1930s, when economic pressures made the placement of clergy women particularly difficult. Critics expressed outrage that both Unitarian and Universalist leaders had turned their backs on women in ministry in support of, quote, a warped vision of vigorous ministry. Things did not improve by the late 1950s, when merger talks were well underway between the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association. In the 1957-58 Directory of Unitarian Ministers, only 9 female ministers were listed, or 2% of their clergy, with none of them being settled ministers. By 1960, the total number of female Universalist ministers had dropped to 18, or 5.4% of their clergy, with only 3 women serving as settled ministers. Women were clearly losing ground in the leadership of both denominations. And the first decade of the new Unitarian Universalist Association brought no improvement. By 1968, the UUA directory listed only 17 ministers as full-time ministers and 4 as associates, accounting for a mere 2% of the 782 ministers in the denomination. The real gains for women's leadership in the UUA began in the decade of the 1970s, when second-wave feminism spread through the ranks of UU women, and the rate of change in the following decades has been staggering. With the support of the Unitarian Universalist Women's Federation and the small group of female UU ministers that remained, the UUA passed a resolution at its 1970 General Assembly that called for a renewed emphasis on recruiting women into ministry and placing women in policy-making positions within the UUA. Women's committees and task forces were formed throughout the member congregations, and more women began to enter UU ministry. By 1978, the UUA directory listed 57 female ministers, representing 6.2% of the clergy. The numbers continue to grow at an accelerated pace so that by 1988, the directory listed 276 female ministers, or 24.9%. And by 1998, there were 504 female ministers, or 49%. 2008 marked the turning point when women began to account for more than half of all UU clergy, including 60% of community ministers and 85% of ministers of religious education. In the most recent numbers I could find, as of 2018, women represented 60% of our clergy and 75% of those preparing for ministry. Though it is too soon to draw any accurate conclusions, it seems safe to predict that the overall percentage of UU clergy women should eventually reach the 75% range, or as older, mostly male ministers retire. A more interesting question is whether that percentage will hold at 75%, having reached some degree of saturation, or will it continue to increase, and why? In considering these statistics, it is also worth noting that since the formation of the UUA in 1961, the number of Unitarian Universalist congregations has remained roughly the same, around 1,000. So these gains represent a significant shift within the denomination in terms of visibility of women in the pulpit. The same wave of feminism that had such an enormous impact on the ministerial leadership of our faith also brought change to the denominational governance, but on a less noticeable scale. The executive leadership of the UUA is headed by a president who serves as the chief executive officer of the association, and a moderator who serves as the chief governance officer and presides over the board of trustees and the annual general assembly. The first female vice president was appointed in 1985, and since then many women have held similar positions. In 1977, Sandra M. Caron became the first female moderator of the UUA, and that position has mostly been held by a woman ever since. And finally, in 2017, the Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray became the first woman elected to serve as president of the denomination. Once galvanized by the feminist zeitgeist, the transformation of Unitarian Universalism was remarkably fast. As other denominations continue to struggle with the role of women in leadership, it is interesting to look at the factors that contributed to this transformation. I suggest there were 7 major factors. 1, the overwhelmingly liberal membership of the UUA made it more receptive to change, and there was a greater tolerance of ambiguity and diversity of beliefs than is seen in more orthodox traditions. 2, the long tradition of social activism and political action facilitated the acceptance of the feminist cause. 3, the debate over biblical authority had long been resolved in favor of a very liberal approach to the Bible, and many Unitarian Universalists no longer found the Bible to even be relevant. 4, having already ordained women for over 100 years, there was no institutional barriers to women in ministry. Rather, it was a matter of women feeling empowered to leave their habitual spheres and enter the ministry, and the economic and cultural forces of the 1960s and 70s really opened that door. 5, like most Unitarian Universalists, many women who found their home in the denomination and went on to become ministers were raised in Christian and Jewish traditions that they found to be too constraining, theologically or culturally, and in some cases, the possibility of ordination was not an option. As a consequence, some of the growth came from women who felt called to ministry and were siphoned away from other denominations which could have benefited from their leadership. New Age, neo-pagan, and other spiritual paths that emphasize ritual and the feminine aspects of the divine, sometimes called theology with an A, had grown in popularity in the United States, and many UU women were attracted to these paths and felt empowered. A good example is the feminist theology course called Cakes for the Queen of Heaven, developed by Reverend Shirley Ann Rank in 1986, that has been extremely popular among UU women. And 7, UU women's groups focused on passing the Women and Religion Resolution at the 1977 General Assembly. Among items listed in the resolution was a call for, quote, all Unitarian Universalists to examine carefully their own religious beliefs and the extent to which these beliefs influence sex role stereotypes within their own families. Sexist language was specifically targeted by a call for the UUA to make every effort to put traditional assumptions and language in perspective and avoid sexist assumptions and language in the future. The passage of this resolution resulted in the creation of a Denominational Women and Religion Committee, and this committee continued to advance women's issues within the UUA and promote denominational introspection until it was seen as no longer necessary in 1996 and discontinued. It was subsequently reborn as Unitarian Universalist Women and Religion, an independent affiliate of the UUA that is more focused on women's spirituality. After decades of change, it would be reckless to suggest that these 7 factors could provide a prescription for success for other denominations still in conflict, but they could provide points for introspection and debate. There are also new social forces in play today that must be considered, and every denomination is different after all. For many denominations, old issues like biblical authority still need to be resolved before any progress can be made. And for women in UU leadership, having essentially reached the promised land in their own denomination, it is possible they could reach out to women in other denominations to assist, but the focus of recent activism has shifted from traditional feminism to broader issues such as LGBTQ rights, climate change, and racial justice. Anecdotal evidence gleaned from the sermons and other writings of contemporary UU clergy women suggests they feel supported in their ministry. Surveys seem to confirm this. And compared to other denominations, relatively few UU clergy women have seriously considered leaving church-related work. If there are any issues of women's equality remaining in the UUA, it is possible that appointment to senior ministerial positions in the largest churches still favor male candidates. But with several women serving in such positions now, it may simply be a lingering result of the time before the percentage of women escalated. We have only recently begun to see the percentages shift among seasoned ministers, since many of today's seasoned ministers were new ministers during the decades of transformation. Another potential issue is that the salary inequity reported in a 1998 survey of ministers may still exist, but with only a limited number of larger UU churches offering more lucrative salaries to begin with, and with most of these jobs going to seasoned ministers, it may just reflect the same offset in timing. In future studies of UU clergy women, changing demographics, especially age and marital status, may start to show an impact, as more older women seem to be seeking ministry as a second career. I've focused on women in ministry and elected leadership today, and we could spend hours just exploring the fascinating women who have served our faith in this way over the centuries. But there are many others who influenced our tradition as lay leaders, authors, scientists, and in all sorts of ways, and we could spend as many hours learning about their lives as well. I would encourage you to do so. As with many of the fathers of our faith, you will quickly see how the mothers were not just contributors to the formation of Unitarian Universalism, but to the formation of America and many of our treasured institutions. They often defied convention and male hierarchy to reform society and the theology of our tradition. Women have come a long way in our movement. And whether the Unitarian Universalist Association is led by men or women these days, it must face the challenge of growing the movement and remaining relevant in an increasingly secular society numbed by consumerism. In a time when most mainline denominations are seeing significant annual declines in membership, the UUA has seen little change in the overall number of members or congregations. Having taken the reins of leadership, perhaps women will be able to advance the inclusive, pluralistic message of Unitarian Universalism as they write the next chapter in the herstory of our denomination. I invite you now to join in our closing hymn, number 346, Come Sing a Song with Me. Our closing words come from the Reverend Dr. Gretchen Woods. Emma Goldman said, "If I can't dance, I won't join your revolution." A subtext for these remarks may well be morphogenesis, or revolution, is upon us. We are talking about the elephant in the living room, the one that simply by being female has altered how we think about ethics, organizational development, spirituality, and a host of other issues within our faith movement. It took a man, Augustine, to separate body and spirit, and it will take all of us, male and female, working together to bring them back together to their fullest extension of life abundant, dancing together, sometimes leading and sometimes following, as we move forward for the greater good of all in pursuit of the values we affirm in our purposes and principles. So may it be.
Please join me now as we speak the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. We'll now have our postlude and invite you to join us in our social hour following the postlude. Thank you.
Bye.